Hi and welcome to this week's Grid Girl with me, Helena. A lot to cover off again this week. So obviously we had the third back-to-back in Hungary at the Hungarian, and you know, lots of stuff to cover from that. Lots of paddock news in terms of the We Racers One campaign, driver news, and a few protests thrown in there as well. And as I mentioned last week, we'll be looking at a little bit into Carlos Sainz's move to Ferrari. So here we go. So this week's qualifying definitely had its ups and downs. In terms of the weather, it was an absolute washout. Although there were some successes because of this rain, especially in the middle field. So, you know, one of the things noted, exceptionally, both Williams made it to Quali 2. Russell again in 12th and Latifi in 15th. You know, great movement by the Williams team, and their qualifying pace is really coming through. So, you know, a lot to say for how much, you know, they've done over the winter period. Albon was massively out of position in the Red Bull, starting in 13th. So the year before in his Toro Rosso, I think he was in at that point, he actually started in 12th, so a worse qualifying. The Ferraris had a much better day. Seb out qualifying Charles, so they were both in 5th and 6th. The McLaren, again, not as much as a high this week on the qualifying period. Saw them quite low down on the grid, so I think they were 8th and 9th. You know, which was a bit of a surprise considering they've had quite a few good weeks of qualifying, really. But no surprise, the Mercedes and the pink Mercedes, as we are now calling it, the Racing Point, blocked out those first two rows. So not surprising, really. You know, the track's probably a bit more suited to them in comparison to Austria. But, you know, who knows how that'll go as the season pans out. Is this now Racing Point's kind of surge forward? We will see. So in terms of the race, again, the weather was not playing into the hands of any driver, really. So we saw a lot of them starting out on the intermediate tyres this week. I think it was just Grosjean, I want to say, maybe was on the full wets. In terms of the mechanics of the day, I think we shall say, definitely should go to the Red Bull team. I mean, we saw the crash that Verstappen had on his way round to the grid, and I think a lot of people thought that was over. In terms of the damage, the team managed to rectify what should have been an hour to an hour and a half job in 20 minutes. So I think that really says something about their mechanics. So it didn't stop Verstappen, though, on his race. In terms of Kimi, got a 5-second penalty for being out of position on the grid. He said he was struggling with the track as it was very kind of what they call greasy because of the weather. So that was before all the race even started. We'd had quite a lot of drama. Bottas, in terms of his start, so was it a false start, was it not? I think it's hard to say with that one because the FIA stewards are saying, well, it didn't set off the trigger, so we think no. Other arguments suggest that because he stopped after the kind of roll forward, that it shouldn't be classed as a false start, but then others are arguing that really it was a false start. His start wasn't great anyway, so, you know, he did have a bit of a struggle on that first lap, and Lewis just went miles ahead. That was really Bottas's opportunity to overtake and kind of win the race for the day, but obviously that didn't happen. You had the early pits from Haas, so they came in, I think, as the race began. So while everyone's on the grid and started from the pit lane, I mean, they were so far down anyway on the grid that probably didn't make much difference. But those early pits kind of played into their hand because at one point they were on the second row. and I think their tyre choices weren't great, so it made sense to bring them in. In terms of the race, so there was a lot of debate over was this rain coming or not. In the end, it didn't, so the tyre changes, probably a lot of changes to kind of get the temperature back in the tyres. Even, you know, the Mercedes were struggling and they've got the DAS system, so I think that really shows that, you know, even with those specialist systems, the tyres were really struggling. Then we had the pit lane incident with Sainz and Latifi, pretty much ending Latifi's race, as there was just quite a bit of damage. He had that puncture and then came back in. As far as we know, you know, it was a shame for Latifi. I think he's had quite a lot of bad luck already this season in terms of things happening, so, you know, a shame for him. For Carlos, it meant that he probably lost a bit of position, coming out in a little bit of traffic as well. Quite a few of the drivers made that mistake on the pit stop, so they were being released into a lot of traffic, which meant that it caused them problems with kind of trying to get ahead and catch up to Lewis. Albon as well, later on, was the track dried out for him at the beginning to keep his tyres back, you know, in more of a better condition and keep the heat in them. We don't really know if that's happened or not. Red Bull are saying no, it didn't. The stewards seem to think that they're going to leave that now, so I guess that's the end of that one. And then Lewis, obviously notably, won the race, so that means he takes Michael Schumacher's title of 7 wins at one track. Lewis now overtaking that to 8 at the Hungarian. So quite an eventful day really, and you know, I think it's definitely shaped up the championship a bit more. The driver rankings obviously have changed and the team rankings have changed slightly, so you know, we've got a week off. Let's see what happens when we get to the British Grand Prix. So, paddock news, and there is a lot of news this week. I've even got a long list this week. So, we shall start off with Renault. So Renault, last week, as I mentioned towards the end of the video, had put in a protest against Racing Point. So we finally found out a bit more about why they're doing this. The main reason seems to be that, obviously, as Racing Point have been called the Pink Mercedes, they think that they are protesting the brake ducts on the car. They believe that if the brake ducts are a copy or a perfect match of the Mercedes one, then there has been some illegality in terms of their car copy. You know, so that again at the end of this race, Mr. Protest himself from Renault went to protest again. Love that they protest that much that he is now notably called Mr. Protest. And the FIA have chose to kind of scrutinise that. They are looking into it. They have looked at sealing parts of the Mercedes team and sealing parts from Racing Point to see, you know, have they broke FIA violation, a violation of rules basically. We Racers 1 came under fire this week. I think definitely notably needed to come under fire. Lewis in his post-race interview mentioned that you know, it's becoming quite disorganised. We saw a little bit of that last week in Austria, where obviously the drivers are still not in unity about taking the knee. There's been, at the beginning of the race, it's been a bit of a dash and people have been running in and like, is it done? Are we doing it? When are we doing it? That kind of situation, which you'd think from a sport that is so time pressured and so organised would be a lot more organised when it comes to this, but clearly not. Lewis has vocalised this and said he will be writing an email to F1 regarding this, because, you know, equally there's not been a lot of talk about what actions they're going to put in place and not a lot of talk about, you know, doing this as a unified body. And it's all well and good to kind of talking the talk and saying, yeah, we support anti-racism, but unless you were kind of showing it or doing something, are you really? Again, the same driver's not taking the knee. Again, that was very much up for debate again. And it just became a bit of a debacle, really, over something that is a gesture that F1 really could do, to kind of show their support, you know, to one of their arguably best drivers in the championship. So it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. I think we've got a few weeks yet of what's going on, so you know, F1, let's see what happens. Moves this week. So, Sebastian Vettel news. I feel like this should become its own feature each week at this rate. So, interesting news around him. He has had an offer from Haas, from Gunther Steinberg. And he has basically said that, yeah, he would be happy to have Seb, no questions asked. This was kind of fueled by the fire from Grosjean. So Grosjean was interviewed this week by Sky Sports F1, I think by Ted Kravitz, who basically, when was asked, you know, are you worried about your seat, are you looking to drive next year, was like, do you know what, I'm not sure. Which was probably a bit of a shock in some respects, but Grosjean had mentioned that actually since lockdown and having that time at home and with his family and doing other things kind of put life into a bit of perspective for him, and actually said it's given him a bit of time to think about things, and is F1 to be all and end all for him. So it'd be interesting to see how the reaction is to that, but that definitely means there potentially may be a vacant seat at the end of this season at Haas. So lots to really see who will fill that. So could it be Sebastian or could it be Checo? Who knows? So Sergio Perez. This has become such a debate now about Racing Point. So the other rumour is that Racing Point are willing to make an offer for Sebastian Vettel. It's still all being kept quiet hush hush. Is it happening? Is it not? Who knows? Literally could go on for hours about this. Realistically, Racing Point is probably the only team, unless Red Bull decide to get rid of Albon, that Sebastian could go to. So in terms of, you know, Sebastian has said he is not here to participate, he is here to compete. And really, if he's here to compete, the Ferrari door's shut. Red Bull seemingly on the outside have shut the door, but whether that is true, we're not sure, because obviously you've got Dietrich Mateschitz saying, you know, bring Seb home, Christian Horner saying it's not happening, Verstappen saying I don't want him there, effectively. So I think that door might be closed, but we can never say never, because, you know, at this point last season we were saying Gasly was not going to be switched teams, and Christian Horner said that, and then it happened. So, you know, we can't always believe what Red Bull tell us. In terms of then, if that Red Bull door is shut, that kind of leaves Mercedes and Racing Point. As the McLaren door is shut, as obviously they've signed Ricciardo, so realistically then, yes, it would be Racing Point, but who would stay? And this has become a massive debate, because even though Sergio Perez is actually in contract and still in contract at the end of this season with Racing Point, obviously Lance Stroll is the boss's son, so everyone's like, well, obviously Lance will stay, even though arguably, you know, Checo is the better driver. And you know, it would be a shame. I think Seb and Checo would be quite a good team at Racing Point. Whereas Lance, where would Lance go? So, you know, questions over would he go to Haas? Would Checo go to Haas? What would go on? Nobody really knows. Nobody's saying anything at the moment. So it's a lot of talk about a lot of things with that. So we will see. I'm just going to switch arms because my hand is aching. In terms of other stuff going on this week, so we've had you know, a lot of noise around Alex Albon this week, and that is why I kind of mentioned before about, you know, would Alex be staying at Red Bull? We seem to be getting the same noise that we got last year with Pierre Gasly, and you know, it concerns me. So their young driver programme has been incredibly successful. You've seen the likes of Sebastian Vettel on there, you know, and you know, you've had Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Max Verstappen was on that young driver programme. Carlos Sainz was on the young driver programme, so you know, you've had a lot of successes, but you know, last season I think the team were very quick to kind of shunt Pierre back to you know, Toro Rosso, now AlphaTauri, and I think my concern is at the moment that the same is going to happen to Alex Albon, and I think this is a really interesting topic because actually Albon at the moment probably isn't performing any better than Pierre did last year, if we're honest. And as much as I have a lot of time and a lot of love for Albon, do I actually think he's a better driver than Pierre Gasly? At the moment, no. I think they're very much on par. Do I think Red Bull are being a bit hasty to kind of shunt one of them out, or kind of be like, right, this driver's not working after 6 races, get rid of them? Yes. And it really does worry me. However, I do think if Albon was put back to Toro Rosso, we would lose Kvyat for good, which for me probably wouldn't be a great loss. You know, he's had a few chances with Red Bull, with Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri, as it's now called, and I do think that he is at risk. I think Albon is potentially at risk of going back to Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri, and I do think that if that seat then became vacant, we could see Vettel back in that seat. And I don't think that's a massive feat of imagination, really, to think that. You know, I think Seb is a good driver. He won 4 World Championships for Red Bull, and they haven't won any since. And that says a lot too. So, you know, I think watch this space. However, we have seen George Russell come out in defence of Alex Albon this week, which I think is a lovely thing to see. Alex and George have known each other for a really long time. They grew up in British karting together, so they know each other really well. And Russell said in an interview this week, you know, don't shoot down Alex Albon because he's an incredibly talented driver. Everything that he's done so far, he has been the best at, has been a winner, has been the shining star. So, you know, he's got the capability there, but just something's maybe not sitting right at Red Bull for him. And I think this year Red Bull haven't had the best start. They've had issues with the car. Even Max has had issues with the car. So I think really that says a lot. And I think Red Bull probably need to start considering, you know, actually, yeah, Albon is being outperformed by Verstappen, but Verstappen's been in that car longer. He's a slightly more experienced driver. He comes from a racing family. And, you know, actually, Verstappen is their number 1 driver, but he's tipped to be the next world champion. And he's incredibly young, and actually we might need to give Albon that time. He's the number 2 driver there for sure, but you know, you can't just keep swapping your number 2 driver out every season, because at the minute that is what Red Bull are doing. You tend to annoy the second driver, they leave, you put another one in, or you switch them teams because they're not good enough. And it's kind of saying a lot now about Red Bull. And finally, in terms of paddock news, we'll end on a good news story. So we saw Lando Norris pictures after the Hungarian Grand Prix of him straight in there with the mechanics, really, dismantling his own car. So I think, good on you, Lando. What a lovely thing to see, and I don't think we've seen that in a long time. A driver being there in the thick of it with the mechanics and learning more. He's got that eagerness to learn, and I think that really shines through for Lando. It says a lot about him and his character. So, what a lovely story to end on. So I wanted to touch this week just on a little segment about Carlos Sainz. So obviously, as we all know, he is moving to Ferrari at the end of this season, and I think a lot's kind of being questioned about this. So, I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is this a good move for Carlos? Now, Carlos idolises, as it's well known, Fernando Alonso. And he wants to follow in his idol's footsteps, and that would mean driving at Ferrari. However, when you look at Fernando's career at Ferrari, he didn't have that much success. He did have a lot of wins there, but he didn't win the World Championship there. He, ultimately wasn't a big fan of being there. And Carlos had a lot more success at McLaren probably than Fernando did. In terms of, do I think the drivers following their drivers' footsteps is working for them? And I think we see this again in Sebastian. So, for example, Sebastian again has a lot of respect for Michael Schumacher. He moved to Ferrari to follow in his idol's footsteps, and it hasn't worked out at Ferrari for him really either. And potentially it raises the question, is it the right thing to do? And part of me is slightly worried for Carlos Sainz that this is not a good move for him. Carlos is a good fit for the brand of Ferrari. He, is very easygoing. He's got great personality. I think he would gel with the team quite well. It's closer to home for him, so he can spend a lot more time with his family. We know he's quite big on spending time with his family in Spain. But the big question is, is that culture going to work for him at Ferrari? Because the culture is incredibly different in comparison to McLaren, where he's had relative success at and really enjoys the team, and you can see that the kind of atmosphere with working at Ferrari is very different. So obviously you've got the Tifosi, which are very strong and opinionated in terms of results and what's happening and negativity. And I actually listened to an interview with Rob Schmedley, who's one of the chief engineers at Ferrari throughout, who's Felipe Massa's kind of chief engineer. And actually, when you listen to what Rob says, you get, if you didn't get a 1-2, it was like it was a massive disappointment and a massive kind of, wind out the sails for the team. And I think actually that kind of energy potentially might bring Carlos down. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with Ferrari. I think this year they've had a lot of bad luck with the car. The car's not been great, really hasn't. And they've brought upgrades, it's slightly better, it's still kind of almost fitting into best of the rest, and it pains me to say that as someone whose favourite drivers have driven for Ferrari, but they are at the minute a best of the rest team, and that's not where Ferrari have been for a long time. And I think, you know, we are starting to see a bit of the Ferrari momentum unravel significantly, and I think this has been happening for a while. As I've mentioned before, Seb's not been happy there. He came from quite a, you know, a good kind of fun team to be with in terms of being with Red Bull. He was quite happy there, won his World Championships there, had the opportunity to go and follow in his idol's footsteps. Didn't work. And it does worry me that the same is going to happen to Carlos. And Carlos is a good driver. I think he is potentially a world champion in the making. He is still quite young. He's only 25, I think. And I do potentially think he could be making a mistake with this move. But I understand why he's doing it. Because let's be honest, who says no to Ferrari? So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out. Obviously, he's got Leclerc there as his teammate. I think relatively they tend to get on. I've not seen anything to kind of suggest differently. But I think, again, that'll be quite a weird and interesting partnership. So we shall see. Watch this space, I think, is really what we need to say.